Good morning. I'm very grateful to be here, and I want to assure you from the start, I will not be using any words you don't understand. When people ask me, since I've been retired from public radio, I was a talk show host, what do you do? I say, I teach in prison. And then they say, what do you teach? And I say, Greek philosophy. And that's as much of a showstopper as when my husband, Alan, is asked the same question, and he says, I'm a geneticist, I study diabetes. Everything shuts down. Teaching Plato in prison has taught me incalculable things. And I would like to share some of them with you this morning. What do we know about the people in prison? Very little. We put our prisons in remote places out in the boonies. And nobody knows who's behind all that razor wire and those electrified fences, except a few monsters like Jeffrey Dahmer and Ed Gein, both of whom happen to be from Wisconsin. It's also shocking to learn that the United States puts more people in prison than any other country in the world, including Myanmar, Russia, and China. It's also shocking to learn, if you live in Madison, Wisconsin, which is constantly touted as one of the best places to live in the United States, that it's also one of the worst places to live in the United States if you happen to be Black and poor. Wisconsin currently houses approximately 25,000 men and women in prison under a draconian system called truth in sentencing, which we got from our wonderful governor, Scott Walker. Truth in sentencing means there is no possibility of parole, no matter how many certificates you earn, no matter how good your behavior is. If you get a 100-year sentence, you're in prison for 100 years. And some of the men in prison are aging and dying in prison. Many incarcerated men are in wheelchairs. I remember in my first session, there was a vet who had been from Vietnam, and he was the most sorrowful man I've ever met in my life. But he came alive in the course of this session that we had. Our very first session, we were in a corridor lined with solitary confinement cells. And the most amazing things happened. There were only 10 of us. One of the men, he was a young man, he had been in prison since he was 14 years old. And he was holding a ball, an orange ball, and squeezing it constantly. He was the victim of fetal alcohol syndrome that he had inherited in utero. But he turned out to be the greatest guy. He was put in solitary confinement right off the bat because he couldn't control himself. He was shouting and screaming all the time. And one of his fellow inmates passed him a dictionary and said, hey, you gotta calm down. Start learning how to read and write. And he became the prison chaplain, the prison librarian, and developed a real love for books. Anyway, if you get out on parole, and there is parole for those who complete their sentences, as likely as not, you're going to go back to prison under another draconian system known as Crimeless Revocation, which means that for some minor infraction, and it could be something as minor as having cinnamon, which can be used as a kind of drug in certain quantities, you get sent back and back and back and back. And as you can imagine, there are drastic public health consequences for families and communities because of this system. Prisons are overcrowded. Most people in prison suffer from some form of mental illness. Men often end up in what they call the hole. Let's see if I can do this. There it is. That's what it means to be in the hole. It's about a 6-by-8 prison cell. No windows, a door, a steel door that is locked from the outside, barred from the outside, open only from the outside. A cement block for what you sleep on, and a toilet. Solitary confinement may last for weeks, months, even years. The United Nations declares that more than 15 days in solitary confinement is considered torture. While blacks represent only 6% of Wisconsin's population, 46% of the men who languish in Wisconsin prisons are black. And here's an odd statistic. Teachers calculate that by the 3rd grade, 1 in 3 black children will end up in prison and adjust their budgets accordingly. But this is a story of healing, redemption, and transformation. I got my idea to teach Plato in prison from Earl Shores, an absolutely wonderful guy, a social critic and a writer who became known in his final years, best known for founding the Clementi course in the humanities. Has anybody heard of the Clementi course in the humanities? It's administered by Bard College now. But it was offered to, in 1995, he began this experiment with 25 students living at the margins of society. An audacious program that professes to teach a rigorous 10-week curriculum in philosophy, history, art, literature, and logic. And if you know, those are the humanities as Petrarch set them out. And these people, among these 25 in Earl Shores' first class, some of them were addicts, some of them prostitutes, some of them ex-cons. After tasting some success, Earl became an apostle for the humanities, traveling tirelessly to some 20 cities where the program took hold. And that wasn't enough. He then went to work among the Mayans. He set up a program among the refugees in Darfur. He went to the Inuits in Alaska, always adapting the curriculum to suit their own values and their own traditions. And he went to Australia, Canada, and Korea. He called his course the Clementi course after Roberto Clemente, who was a great humanitarian baseball player. You may have heard of him. He died in a plane crash carrying supplies, food, and so forth to Nicaragua to succor the people who had been through an earthquake. Earl received the National Humanities Medal presented to him in 2000 by President Clinton. He died a year ago on May the 27th in New York at the age of 75. So where did he get this crazy idea to treat the effects of poverty with the classics? Interestingly enough, he got it right out of prison. He was inspired by an inmate who was visiting in Bedford Hills Penitentiary, a maximum security prison for women in Bedford Hills, New York. It happens to be just a few miles from where I grew up. He was researching one of his many books on poverty. And in a conversation with Vine's Walker, Earl asked, "Vine, why do the poor stay poor?" "Because they lack the moral life of downtown." She was quick to respond, and then she added, to make herself clear, plays, museums, concerts, lectures. Imagine for a minute that you had never been to a play, you had never been to a lecture, you had never been to a conference like this. You had never been to a museum. Imagine the deprivation, mental, psychological, spiritual, that you would have suffered. Earl was surprised. "You mean the humanities?" "Yes, Earl, the humanities," Viney said. "Teach the allegory of the cave. The ghetto is the cave. People in prison can understand that. Poor people can understand that. So Earl rounded up his poker buddies to be his fellow teachers, starting with Plato's Allegory of the Cave. The course was modeled after the great books course that he himself had studied as a precocious teenager entering the University of Chicago at the age of 13. Here he is among some young men in Buenos Aires. Well, Vonnie Walker changed Earl from a social critic to a champion of the poor, preaching the gospel of the humanities like the Apostle Paul. He saw his mission to spread dignity outward from the classroom. He saw himself not as doing God's work, but the work of Petrarch, the 14th century scholar who studied the ancients in order to learn what kind of soul, what strength of character one might attain for himself. So much of the teaching that goes on in a Clementi course in the humanities, and the one that we adapted in Wisconsin, which we call Odyssey, uses the Socratic method of vigorous question and answer. In the intensive give and take, students begin to question their assumptions, not only about the texts they are reading, but more importantly, about how they are living their lives. If only we did this in our college classrooms, we'd have a pedagogy of love. Parker Palmer's phrase. They begin to discern patterns in a series of life choices that may have led them to sorry ends. And as we know from Plato, the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living. Study the humanities. Science is not enough. So what's interesting, and here's the connection with what Larry's goal is here with these symposia, is he believed that poor people were born into a surround of force. Imagine the ghetto. And all they could do is react, often violently. And the task, the challenge, is to move from reaction to reflection. And here's an interesting, and that means you become a citizen. You can participate in what the Greeks called the polis, the city-state, the life that we all enjoy so abundantly, the life of culture, the life of our civilization. We participate in that so richly. People who are born into the ghetto haven't a clue. So he told the story of his crazy educational experiment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in an article that appeared in the September 1997 issue of Harper's Magazine. It actually changed my life to read that article. It was called On the Uses of a Liberal Education, a Weapon in the Hands of the Restless Poor. And in that article, he told this story, which illustrates, I think, magnificently just how this conversion can happen, moving from reaction to reflection. One Saturday morning in January, Earl wrote, David Howell telephoned me at home. David Howell was a student in Earl's first class. Mr. Shores, he said, anglicizing his name. Mr. Howell, Earl responded. How are you doing, Mr. Shores? I'm fine. How are you? I had a little problem at work. Uh-oh, Earl thinks. Bad news is coming. David was a big man, generally good-humored, but with a quick temper. According to his mother, he had a history of violent behavior. In the classroom, he had been one of the best students, a steady man, 24 years old, who always did the reading assignments and who often made interesting connections between the humanities and daily life. What happened? Mr. Shores, there's a woman at my job. She said some things to me, and I said some things to her. And she told my supervisor I had said things to her, and he called me in about it. She's 40 years old, and she don't have no social life. And I have a good social life. She's jealous of me. And then what happened? Mr. Shores, she made me so mad, I wanted to smack her up against the wall. I wanted to talk to some friends to calm myself down a little, but nobody was around. And what did you do? Earl was thinking this was the one telephone call from the city jail. Mr. Shores, I asked myself, what would Socrates do? I was hooked. I'm also a product of a liberal arts education, and when I was going through some pretty bad times in Kentucky, trying to raise my 2 boys and trying to get out of a terrible custody fight, I really needed the humanities. I was poor, down, and out, and it was my platform of the humanities. I wanted to climb back up on that platform, and it was the humanities that hauled me out. I invited Earl to be a guest on my talk show on Wisconsin Public Radio, and when he came to Chicago a short time later, I followed him around all weekend while he was setting up another Clementi course with the help of the Illinois Humanities Council. And I was so inspired by this little guy who had been a bullfighter in Mexico as a young man. He was so determined, and he held people to account. I'll never forget how he went into the alderman's office. The alderman had promised that he would help him do this. And he had written his words in his book. And he held the book out and said, look, you said this. Now you got to honor it. He had no choice. So I was very inspired. And my mind closed like a fist on my resolve. We were going to do this in Madison, Wisconsin. And so we did. There's one of our classes. We have just had our 16th graduation exercises on May the 8th this month. Graduating, now mind you, this is a course under the auspices of the UW. It carries 6 university credits for anybody who makes it through the year. And the amazing director we have, Emily Auerbach, who is in the middle. Maybe see I can point her out to you. She's right there. She doesn't let people fall through the cracks. So as often as not, all 30 make it through and earn all 6 credits. And then 3/4 of them go on to receive advanced degrees. This distinguished-looking young woman was in our first class. Her name is Tanisha. She earned a master's degree in social work at Edgewood College. This amazing man, who is a big man, his name improbably is Eugene Smalls. Eugene is one of my favorite people. He had a conversion experience while he was in prison. And when he was on his way out, they said to him, "We're going to keep the lights on." And that is code for, we expect you're going to come back. And Eugene says, I am going to come back. When I come back, I'm going to come through that front door, and I'm going to be wearing cufflinks. He made good on that promise. He is now a prison chaplain. He works tirelessly in all of Wisconsin's prisons as a chaplain. When he went through his graduation exercises, he said, eloquently, simply, and memorably, I was born in prison. My mother died giving birth to me. You don't forget that. This man, you know, every teacher has a pet. This man is James Morgan, and he is my pet. He was the smartest the smartest. He still is. He's just an amazingly smart man. He spent more than 20 years in prison. He still has an electronic cuff he wears. He's still under supervision, even though he now holds a very responsible job with the Madison Urban Ministry, counseling peer groups of newly released men. He helped me, actually, adapt and design a curriculum teaching the allegory of the cave, which he credits with having transformed his life, teaching in prison. This is Jerry Hancock, my buddy, my partner. He is a minister. He used to be the DA, and he underwent a conversion experience and decided he had a call to the ministry, and he set up the, what is it? I just lost it. Director of the Prison Ministry Project. How could I forget that? And this is all at last year's UW-Odyssey graduation. So Jerry invited me to go with him to prison for his restorative justice class. I did that a couple of times. And then I went to a graduation exercise in one of Wisconsin's prison. And it was so exciting. It was so elating. I said, hey, I want to do this. So we started modestly. And slowly we built up, starting with the Allegory of the Cave, which is the perfect text. This 2,500-year-old text is absolutely perfectly adapted to teaching men in prison. Here's Plato himself. Plato had his own heartbreaking story. He was Socrates' most favored apostle, his student. And when Socrates was executed for teaching, trying to illuminate the lives of his Athenian citizens, fellow citizens, he was executed. And Plato was devastated. He went into exile. He stayed wandering for 10 years. He came back to Athens and set up the first university in the Western world, and began writing Socrates' dialogues down. Because Socrates, he taught in the open agora. He didn't believe in writing anything down. He wanted that vigorous give and take that goes on in real conversation. That's why I love him, because I was a talk show host. And if it hadn't been for Plato, we would know nothing about Socrates. Here he is, on his deathbed, as the 17th century artist Jean-Jacques David portrayed him. You can see Plato as an old man. He wasn't. He was a young man. He's there.
Can you point to the screen? You have to point at the screen, not the computer.
Thank you. Yeah. Socrates used the very last moments of his life to continue teaching. He never gave up. And he somehow knew that we would be here talking about him and his ideas. This is what he really looked like. He had the face of a satyr. He had a paunch. He went around in the same stinky toga all year long. A man who is easy to lampoon, and he was by Aristophanes in his plays, one of the reasons why he got into so much trouble. So, the cave. In Plato's allegory of the cave, human beings live all their lives in an underground cave with legs and necks chained so that they cannot move or turn their heads. They can only see their own shadows, or the shadows of one another, which a fire blazing at a distance behind them throws on the cave wall. This is here are the shadows. Here are the prisoners. These are actors who carry figures across this parapet that are made to represent the things of this world as we apprehend them. Here's the fire. Here's the way out. This is one of the prisoners who is struggling because he is blinded by the light. He eventually makes it out, and then he's got to go back down because he remembers the plight of his fellow prisoners and feels an obligation to do his part to enlighten them. Here's another version where you see the shadows. In this one, the prisoner is here. The things are there, people holding them up. And the shadows are monstrous. Odyssey students readily identify with the metaphor of the cave and the plight of prisoners, as you can well imagine, shackled and fettered and kept underground all their lives. The cave comes to symbolize all manner of woes they have experienced firsthand: alcohol and drug abuse, drug addiction, racism, ignorance, oppression, exploitation, domestic and sexual abuse, even the literal shackles of prison itself, as well as the legacy of ancestral slavery. But Plato intended the allegory for all of us. Jerry Hancock acknowledged that his cave was the white suburb that he was born into and grew up in. I tell people that my cave was the Roman Catholic religion I was born into that made me believe that it was the one true religion. I've been since disabused of that idea. Arrogance can be a cave, elitism can be a cave, American exceptionalism can be a cave. Anything that limits us, limits our minds from expanding, and keeps us in our tribes, a cave. So we got a rather extraordinary response to the question, what was the cave you were born into that led you to this cave? From a young man in prison who gave us 100 caves. I'm not going to give you all 100, but I want you to have a sense of the flavor of this extraordinary document that he wrote. Being mixed was a cave. Being curious was a cave. Suffering was a cave. Dead bodies outlined in chalk was a cave. Eye contact was a cave. Streetlights were a cave. Hustling was a cave. Leave it to Beaver was a cave. Thuggin' was a cave. Being counted out was a cave. That look of disgust was a cave. Don't ask that silly-ass question again was a cave. Shame was a cave. Guilt was a cave. Fear was a cave. Failure was a cave. Being born was a cave. And then this exercise for him was obviously cathartic and therapeutic. And he writes, of all the caves I listed, none of them currently confine me. In short, ignorance kept me beholden to these caves. Over the years that I have been incarcerated, I have been allowed to do the one thing that will forever liberate me from any cave: know thyself. It has been quite the adventure examining my own life. To this end, my life is very much worth living. Socrates was killed for shedding light on the caves of his time, but that did not stop him, or Plato. While I am no Socrates, to stop asking similar questions would put me squarely right back where his allegory of the cave found me, in a cave. Jerry found online this rather extraordinary replication of the allegory of the cave. Happens to be the courtyard in Robbins Island, where Nelson Mandela was in prison for 18 of the 27 years that he was incarcerated. And you can see the lineup. And what they were forced to do all day was chip away at these blocks of stone that had absolutely no purpose. They were used for nothing. They were simply thrown away. And so what was intended to be a mind-numbing and soul-killing exercise in futility Nelson Mandela turned into the University of the Lime Pit, where they educated one another. Each one teach one was their motto. And when they got out finally, and there was a new country of South Africa, and apartheid was over, these men were able to assume highly prestigious and responsible positions. So we use this as an inspiration for what we were trying to do in prison. One of our men, out of recognition of the inspiration that he derived from Nelson Mandela, did this portrait of him. We also include Invictus, this poem by William Ernest Henley that has had such an interesting history. It was composed by a man who had his legs amputated and was deeply devastated by this. You know this poem? How many of you know Invictus? It's a great poem. It has so many uses, both on the bad side and on the good side. FDR had a copy of it in the Oval Office. Vietnam vets in prison, prisoners of war, used to pass it around from one to the other. One reported on having been given a copy that was written in rat shit. That's how important this thing was. This is one of the most remarkable things that happened to me in prison. On the last day of class, I was presented with this poster. And this poster shows a woman beaten up with a black eye, bruises, waiting in a bus stop. And behind her is a copy of the poem Invictus. We tell the men that Nelson Mandela, as his first exercise in the University of the Lime Pit, would make the men recite Invictus by heart, memorize it. So we do that too. And so here it is, out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced or cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody, but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. And yet, the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Now, what's really remarkable about this, and I didn't realize it until I got the poster home and looked at it closely, there is a second poem embedded in the first, and you can see it here. I am unconquerable. My head is unbowed. Find me unafraid. I matter. For me, this was extraordinarily moving because Plato believed that we have wisdom innate in us, and you can't teach that. You can only draw it forth. So when somebody as beat up as one of these guys comes up with this self-assertion of worth, you know you've done your job. Here's another example of working with the shadows. We tell the men that the shadows represent things that they may have heard growing up that sent them in the wrong direction. A lot of them have heard that they're no good, that they're worthless, that they're going to end up in prison, and they fulfill this prophecy. So we ask them to work with that and to find their way through the shadows, to be disabused of the delusions that have gotten them into prison and gotten them stuck. So this man writes, "I've been stuck in my cave most of my life. A functional alcoholic, drinking since the age of 9. My family owned a few bars, and watching the daily flow of drunks drinking their problems away became the norm. The truth is, I stayed locked up in my cave, stayed intoxicated because I didn't like the real me. My cave was sealed. When I think of that shadow on the wall, I see a monster. I saw my father in that shadow, an abusive drunk, cold-hearted and distant. I was afraid of him. That shadow was responsible for a lot of pain inflicted on me and my family. I've had a lot of time to sit back and evaluate my life. When I read the Allegory of the Cave, it hit me like a ton of bricks. My image of the shadow was wrong. The shadow, that master, that monster I thought was my father, is really me. I've been running from and fearing my own shadow all my life." You could be in therapy for many years and not come to that conclusion. Another one of our men in prison, I suspect he was the one who did the portrait of Nelson Mandela, was so, at first we were a little bit reluctant to, after the Allegory of the Cave, bring the apology into the curriculum because it's a much more dense text and it's difficult. But this guy couldn't find a single paragraph that resonated with him because he enjoyed it so much he went on to read the Crito as well. And he writes, "Socrates believed that a life without the freedom to scrutinize both his own beliefs and the beliefs of others was not a life worth living. After he is sentenced to death, he warns the jurors who voted against him that they will come to understand they cannot silence the people's voice of criticism by executing the critics. He refers to the jurors who voted to acquit him as the only true judges, and he comforts them by explaining that death might not be a punishment at all, that if death is just an eternal sleep, it will be like an undisturbed, dreamless night, which is a restful and pleasant thing. And if it is a voyage to a better place, how amazing it will be to meet and to talk with the great heroes who have gone before, heroes who would never put a man to death simply for questioning their opinions." I found his last words to the jury. "Now it is time that we were going, I to die and you to live. But which of us has the happier prospect is unknown to anyone but God." To be so melancholy, resigned, and contented all at the same time that it was more than a little overwhelming. In the last class we did in the fall, we decided to try an experiment in self-portraiture, which is something that they do in UW-Odyssey. So we borrowed the art history professor, Gene Phillips, and he very readily came with us. And now he's begging to come back. He had such a good time. So in this first response, we have a rather remarkable self-portrait. This is a man named Anton, and he tells his story as a film script, and himself as an apple seed. There's the apple. And this, of course, he says this is where he was born, but it's a prison cell. The apple seed is falling. And in the second frame, the apple releases the seed. He says that those seeds, because of his parents, had cyanide in them. And that was the original poisoning that affected his life. The second frame is the day his mother, who seems to have been a bad guy in his life, passed away. I start to shed and leave my old views behind. And we see the worm exiting from the prison cell. In the next frame, we see the worm free and climbing the tree. He says, the day I got out of the hold, meaning solitary confinement, and start to move according to how I see things. In the fourth frame, he wraps himself in a cocoon and start to move according to how I see things. And then he comes to WRC, which happens to be the Wisconsin Resource Center, where it's actually a treatment facility for people with mental illness. Almost everybody in prison has some degree of mental illness. And we were able to function very, very well in the WRC because it's organized under the Department of Health rather than the Department of Corrections. And the guards are part of the process. And it's very salubrious. That's a word I'm sure you do understand. So when he comes to the WRC, he wraps himself in a cocoon of knowledge. And then when the restorative justice comes and the Odyssey Project, he jumps in head first. And there you see him going towards the light. In the next self-portrait, this one is by Robert, who I really didn't have any high hopes for. I fully expected him to drop out. And then he turned out to be just great. And he describes himself as a giver. So he has an open hand, a helping hand. Each finger has one of his most important values: faith, family, friends, children, altruism. The top right section, you can see the parts of his life he's left behind. The dice, he was a gambler. And then he has these phrases that mean so much to him. Don't wait to hit bottom, learning to love, give unto others. That's the beginning of the golden rule. He shows the Bible here. He shows the Salvation Army, where he was a volunteer. He shows coming out of darkness, a new beginning, and more. And here's the ear that represents that he's a good listener. And then God visits me every day. In this one, this is by a man named Michael, who became a Buddhist in prison. And it's very interesting. He has the warrior, himself as a warrior at the top. This is the sword that leads to the Dharma wheel, where you see all the right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, right view. The time is now. The sword leads right down into the heart of the lotus, which represents enlightenment. On the bottom, he has mentally dwelling on negativity, which he's trying to rule out of his life. He has solitary confinement with tears of blood and chains. He has a broken heart in the left corner, which is mended in the right corner. He has peace, cessation of suffering, work with our suffering, strength. On the left-hand side, patience, creator, teachers, knowledge and wisdom, universe. Oh, okay, let me just finish very quickly. This next one, a very complicated guy, very smart, about to get out, scared to death. You can see three children's chairs representing his three children. He's trying to get out of the rigidity of black and white thinking, and this is supposed to be the gray. Fight your fears, gray. He actually attached his life story, his autobiography, what's the worst that could happen. And then the last one you absolutely must see. It's not a very good slide because it was a three-dimensional replication of a toilet, and it was done by a man named William, who said, "I've done a lot of shitty things in my life, but each flush represents a new beginning." I don't know if there's any time for questions, or if there are any questions. Are there any questions? Yes? Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have time for one or two questions. Yes.
Up there.
Thank you for your talk. I was hoping you could potentially speak to recidivism risk algorithms and perhaps how the questionnaires that feed the algorithms could potentially be modified to more accurately assess this change of thought from reaction to reflection.
Well, I can tell you that there's a lot of effort being, in Wisconsin, there's a very strong criminal justice reform movement, and a lot of attention is being paid to crimeless revocation. And I just consulted with Frank Davis, who's the director of MOSES, which is our, it's under the umbrella of Wisdom, the statewide criminal justice reform movement. And he told me that there has been some movement of sorts, and that some of these draconian rules, I mean, you get out of prison and you get a book of rules. It's Kafkaesque, it's Baroque. And that's being modified somewhat, and parole officers are being counseled to lay off a little bit. So that's really all I can tell you about that, except that it's very much underway. And of course, you probably know that criminal justice reform has been a national issue, and it's received a lot of attention. And unfortunately, Wisconsin is retrograde. We're one of the worst. But places like Mississippi and Texas have made real progress. Somebody else had a question?
Yeah, just a comment. I'm a nurse midwife. I cared for women in prison and delivered their babies in hospital. And the strength that I felt at that point in their lives, which was really the beginning and the end of motherhood for them, was amazing. And I wish I could have had some of this to bring to them. I brought other things, but the picture, the person who said, I was born in prison, I cared for those babies.
Yeah, and again, there's a movement in Wisconsin, or at least attention being brought to the sorry truth that women are shackled when they give birth.
Not my hospital. Our chair would not let them be shackled.
Good for
Not
you.
in my hospital.
Yeah, I mean, that's terrible.
Well,
we
have to take a break to stay on schedule. We will reconvene at 10:45. Jean, thank you for a really moving and powerful talk.
Thank you very much.